Good morning. My name is Stephan John. I have met and worked with a number of people in the room before, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. I've mentioned to a number of people that when we talk about NQFs in Europe and around the world, we tend to think about documents. We tend not to think about actual implementation. So I'm very, very pleased that actually this project has started to work on that. Back in 1995 in England, we started a brand new organization which was based around implementing our NQF, which had started actually really in the late 1980s, believe it or not. And we decided we needed a new body with lots more people in order to implement our NQF. And I came along, and we had at that time, believe it or not, something like 6,000 informal qualifications which had been funded by government at some point. And my job with the team was to try to bring those 6,000 qualifications programs into the framework in some way. If you can imagine, 6,000. So when somebody came to me probably 3 or 4 years later and said there are some countries in Central Europe and they want to start NQFs and they maybe need some people to come in and give them some advice, I said to them, my advice is to them to not do it. It's madness. And it's true. That is what that was my advice. Because I couldn't imagine how this thing could be done simply. Having said that, as I think somebody mentioned Britain in the earlier presentation, I should be very, very clear. You have had Scottish partners as part of this program, and Irish, and I should be very, very clear that obviously England and Ireland have completely separate education systems. Everything in Scotland is more simple. Probably everything apart from the weather, actually. The weather in Scotland is very complicated to negotiate, but it very much so. So there is much more understanding. It's a much more simple system to understand. So sometimes you'll hear me compare and contrast the two, because our system in England is very, very complicated. And if there's one piece of advice I would probably give you, it's not to create a system which looks like ours, in fact. Because it is a system. This is the thing to remember. It isn't just a bunch of documents. I think often the documents look great. And as a consultant, I've been involved in writing lots and lots. And trying to explain them, and people nod their heads and they go home, but the implementation is very much a big juggernaut, a big train which needs to start, and you need to keep it moving. We start with legislation. Who does it apply to? And this was a question that we came across in England. Okay, we have all of these laws and rules and regulations. Who does it really apply to? And in England, it applies to people who develop the qualifications. In fact, almost solely, all of the rules pretty much mention the developers. We very rarely mention teachers or employers or anybody else within the legislation. And that then, if you like, has an effect on how qualifications are developed, who develops them, what they look like, and so forth. Developers are very much experts. So therefore the qualifications will look good, but will they necessarily give you the outcomes that you require? It's something that you definitely need to have a think about. How much flexibility is built into your system? Our system in England has actually quite a lot of flexibility. The problem with that is that you have sprawling qualifications all over the place. We have thousands of qualifications with hundreds of bodies who are available to develop them. After the legislation, we have to communicate. Who are we communicating to? Well, ideally, everybody. We are trying to communicate to parents, to employers, to students, as well as the normal government officials and official bodies who sit within education. The problem that we have is actually that we need different messages for them all. And that becomes quite difficult because we have to look at the motivations of all of these different groups. But one of the things that we have really started to find out, as I started to find out, we've been going at this for 25 years, and we're just starting to find out that actually everybody has to really be involved in this. So now I'm very, very lucky that actually I have children who come home and tell me what their learning outcomes are for the semester, which is amazing. How can a 13-year-old, maybe even an 8-year-old know what their learning outcomes are? But they do now. This is something that they understood. I think I went through the whole of my school, and I don't think I could give you one learning outcome for the whole 15 years that I went. But you know, I have the pieces of paper which tell me about this. And it's quite important to think about these things. Especially when we look forward for parents, teachers, children, young people, do they know what they're doing? Because that's one of the things that the NQF really should be helping with. As I said, in the UK we started new bodies, we had old bodies, we had government bodies, we had local bodies, and nobody wanted to give their ground. Now this is the problem. Nobody wants to change, nobody wanted to do anything different, nobody wanted to give up any of their current responsibilities. So what we did is we just built more bodies on top and in the middle and so forth. That's what we did. So now we have a layer which is six-fold. It becomes almost impossible to understand who does what. Recently I've done some work with Southeast Asia. In Vietnam, believe it or not, there are 13 different types of body who have to be involved with approval. From local level to government level, in this Ministry of Labour representative and Ministry of Education representative, it's a crazy system. Worse still was Malaysia, because it's split into lots of islands. We found that sometimes with a qualification there are 33 different types of bodies who could be involved in the approval of a qualification. So my advice would be then to try to keep it as simple as possible. Because the thing that we found also in Malaysia is that these different groups of bodies don't talk to each other. So when qualifications disappear or they want a new one to come about, nobody knows where it's gone or where it's coming from, why it might have disappeared, and so forth. A very, very strange situation, but this is what can happen unless we're willing to reform. With the rollout, what do? Do we pilot like happened in Scotland and Ireland, where we take a few qualifications or part of the qualification system and we start with that? Or do we deal with one hit at one time, which is what happened in South Africa? Who I'm currently working with the South Africans at the moment. The problem that we have with rolling the system out is that then has an effect on the capacity. Do we have people? Do we have administration? Do we have IT? Do teachers know what is happening? And so forth. And I've been to a number of countries where the NQF is being implemented, and some people know about it, and other people have no idea why things are happening to them, and therefore commitment tends to be low. Macedonia is a good example where I think we worked with the IPE there, and the commitment was very low because nobody understood what was happening to them and why. So resourcing is quite important, and one thing I would always say before anybody starts with the NQF implementation is it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you money. Unfortunately, that is the case. You know, it will cost you money to arrange and rearrange these things. So you have to have that thought, or a government at least needs to have that thought in their mind. that actually there is a cost. Not just, unfortunately, you know, maybe an EU or a UNESCO project which comes in for a couple of years and designs a few things. The next 5 years, maybe the next 10 years, you are going to be resourcing this new system. So who controls? I worked in Saudi Arabia. Some of you will know a little bit about Saudi Arabia. Very simple. The king says yes or the king says no. It's very, very easy. And we loved it like this. If we can persuade the king or the prince, then everything is done. There we go. Obviously, in most countries, that's not necessarily the case. In South Africa, there was a very big cultural issue, because obviously we see it as one country. Actually, they see themselves as probably 6 or 7 different nations or states within a country in terms of their ethnicity and religion and so forth. So do they all want to do the same thing? Often, no. They don't want to do the same thing. It's quite difficult getting them all in a room to do the same types of things. In Nigeria, very, very similarly, but actually in Nigeria, the cultural issue for us was that actually they didn't want to follow the rules. They don't trust central government. So if central government comes with another set of rules, another set of documents, another legislation, we don't want to follow it. In fact, we want to do the opposite of anything that happens there. So how do we control this? How do we control this framework? Who do we control? What is the teeth that we have? And I think actually sometimes when we write the legislation, again, it sounds good, but the first thing I will normally look for is how do we enforce any of this? Do we just write it, or can it be enforced within a country? And that's very much cultural. As you know, capacity is a big issue, which is to some extent what this project has been about. It's having people who understand the system and know how things work. I've been to very many places where, unfortunately, after a few months, they say, you just get on with it. Forget about this capacity building. Forget about everybody needing to know. We have our own jobs right now. You just do what you need to do. Which is great for me, because I will work with my small group of colleagues in a small room, and we will produce everything that they need, and nobody understands it apart from us, which is great. And then they invite you back again to then explain to them what it's all about. And then they invite you back again to maybe help them with the implementation. So these are the things we need to think about. I mean, teachers, heads of school, and so forth. We worked in Turkey a few years ago, 2013. I found that actually the heads of almost all of the schools had no idea about this NQF that was really being built. Right? And these were heads, these were not teachers. These were the guys who were running the schools. They didn't really understand this leveling and so forth. So how can we implement if they don't know? Obviously, this comes down to a lot to do with what is your motivation. And it's quite important to remember what the motivations are. They're not always the same. Government's motivations, our government in England, our motivation at the moment seems to be international comparison. And this drives everything. We've changed our Matura system in the last 2 or 3 years just for international comparison, mainly for PISA results. So then the whole system will change around this. I can tell you, 10, 15 years ago, nobody in England knew what PISA was. Now everybody seems to know what it is, and we are changing our system for it. I'm not sure whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. The problem is that now we have the government looking outwards. We have the private sector, schools and so forth, who are looking inwards, especially the private sector. They're saying, what is this qualification system doing for us? How is it meeting our labour market needs and so forth? And our government is not too worried about that, it seems. So we have conflict when it comes to motivation, and then that just causes confusion. So the other thing to remember is obviously the NQF will change the behaviour of everyone if it comes alive. I could talk about our system in England where, for us, if a qualification is in the framework, it is eligible for funding. If it's not in the framework, it's not necessarily eligible for funding. So, and funds at level 2 are higher than funds at level 3. And you can see where the motivations will go. I want my qualification to be in the framework at level 2. Why? Not because it does the most for the labour market, not because it does the most for the students, but because that's where the money is. It's in level 2 in the framework. And I can tell you that we have qualifications which are set in this fashion. I've been in a situation where I've had qualifications come to me where I've said, this doesn't feel like a level 2 qualification, it feels like a level 3 qualification. And surely the learning outcomes are not quite right. Or you seem to have just added on some learning outcomes just for, for the use of some words, some semantics, some use of nice sentences which don't seem to meet the qualification here. And actually then we realize when we get to the bottom of it is that actually they want the qualification to sit somewhere specific in the framework because this is where they will get the most funding from their local authority. And this is not right. This is not how we're supposed to develop the qualifications. But this is how incentives work. This is how your stakeholders will respond when you start to put things into boxes, which the framework often does. Yeah. So what we have now, and this is something that I love to talk about, is a market for qualifications. I know here in Poland, for instance, it's slightly more centralized. In many countries it is. Once you allow, actually for us, where the issue was that we wanted the labour market to start to take control. We wanted the private sector to start to take control. We wanted our qualifications to have meanings to a full range of people. We wanted the academic qualifications and vocational qualifications and higher qualifications of different types, all to come into the framework. And so in order to do this, a number of developers said, oh, we can do this, and we can meet these needs, and we can meet those needs, and so forth. We now currently have something like 160 to 170 qualification developing bodies, and we have thousands of qualifications. So we have a market. They come from different developers, different levels, different learning outcomes, all sorts of different titles, and all of them need a value. And that's because that's what the NQF does. It gives everything a value. The problem is with that value is now we attach it to money. We attach it to a price, to a cost. So now we are now talking about, well, how much is a level 3 in mechanical engineering worth exactly? And we're measuring it. We measure it by how big it is, we measure it by the level that it's at, but we also measure it in pounds, because we still have those. We measure it in pounds, we measure the cost in pounds, and now we are starting to say, well, to the student, how much money will the student make if he or she does this? Some of these calculations are good and they make sense, but it's very, very difficult to organize your labor market in this fashion. Because now I have students who only want to do certain courses because they cost X amount of money, and this is how much money they will make when they leave. And organizing your labor market in this sort of fashion is very, very difficult. And we're finding that it's now starting to become very, very difficult. So the NQF can be divisive also. As I said, my job originally was to start off looking at qualifications or programs which already exist. But this market, then because when we say who's writing qualifications, who can write them, what happens to existing ones, we're almost talking about little products. Now in some cases that's a good idea, and in some cases you have to look, is a qualification really just a product? Is that all it is? Is there not more to education than that? And we now have teachers, especially educationalists, who are starting to enter the forum with this argument. Are we just writing qualifications for the labour market? Is that all? Is there nothing wider than that? Or is our qualifications just to get us into university? Nothing else? This is it? What about the 50 years that our young people will have to work for? In the UK, we will leave school at 18, like most places. We retire at 68. So they have 50 years. And we give them qualifications to 18, maybe to 21, maybe to 23, 24, and that is supposed to equip them for 50 years. And so how do these get developed? Are these really just products? I'm not even going to talk about higher education because this is a problem, right? There you go. Higher education is a problem everywhere. I don't know how, but I hear that things work well in Scotland and that universities understand the system and accept the qualification framework. In England, I'm not sure whether they even know that the qualification framework exists even after 25 years. If they do know that it exists, they are ignoring it. There's no two ways about that. Quite seriously, you can't go to the Oxfords, the Cambridges, and the London universities and so forth and talk about qualification framework. They are only interested in the Matura, and that's it, or our version of this. Nothing else. It's academics or otherwise, that's it. And this is a big problem for us, I think. The interesting problem is when we talk about access and progression. Are you giving everybody access to the qualifications they need? Are you giving people progress through the qualifications that they require? If some of your universities, some of your higher education does not recognize this at all. And that then becomes a problem because, as I said, can you really just finish your education at 18 and say I'm equipped? Probably not. As I mentioned before, where does the labour market stand in this? At the moment, I think the labour market, for us, the private sector, is very, very interested in qualifications because they see the burden more and more being piled on them. So the idea is to find out a little bit more because they're working within the system. That's a good thing. Some countries, as you know, will have a levy, some kind of tax for training and so forth. It gives them an incentive to be involved. But as I said, the problem then becomes, what do we recognize in terms of work-based learning? In Macedonia, for instance, just as an example, we found that work-based learning was not recognized in the framework at all. What do we do then? If apprenticeships, work-based learning is not recognized, then where is the incentive for our young people to get skills? No incentive. So the labour market, the private sector is important in this. So as I said, I mentioned Scotland there because it seems to work very, very well in Scotland. Every time I've been to Scotland, we have positive discussions and positive outcomes, it seems. And even, as I said, I mean, there is a talk of independence for Scotland, but every time I speak to somebody from Scotland, they are very nice to me. So I presume that things are working well up there because of that. But as you can see, if you look at this, the way that things work here, just as a simple example, this is all about communication and understanding and discussion and so forth. In some ways, the simpler your system, the better. But you have to have a singular goal. The issue that we have, I think, and the complete contrast in some ways is the English system and some of the systems that we've seen in Southeast Asia where there are a number of different local authorities and cultures and so forth where all of these groups are not talking to each other. They don't understand each other and they are not operating on the same forum. So can we have progression? Do we really have access? A very good issue for us, for instance, in South Africa is we have everybody is supposed to have access now to the system. However, unfortunately, some parts of the system don't talk to each other. So it's not possible to access the system with vocational qualifications in some places. It is in other places, it's not in some places. In some places you have to have academic qualifications, in some places you literally cannot go from an academic qualification to a vocational qualification. They're not talking to each other. This is not what the NQF is supposed to do. So all of these areas, we talk about verification of non-formal, informal learning, and some places credit transfer and so forth. The system has to talk. There has to be one forum. And this is what the NQF really needs to try to develop. Very, very difficult to do that on paper. That has to be done with people. Only people can do this. So just to finish off, joint ownership seems to have been where I've seen success, maybe Australia, maybe Scotland. Simpler systems, joint ownership, everybody with a similar goal, early stakeholder involvement, and that means stakeholders right across the board, some clear alignment, some clear relationships, and so forth. As I said, I would probably say Australians always seem to be happy, New Zealanders still always seem to be happy, Scotland always seems to be quite happy, Ireland is actually quite happy most of the time. No? Because when it gets complicated, then you're not happy. So if you come to London especially, nobody smiles. I'm sure that most of that is to do with the fact that our NQF is far too complicated.